Hello to everyone and greetings and welcome to our session today by Mobilize Your City, reforming paratransit with Mobilize Your City's catalog of measures. I'm going to start now since we are already plenty of people here. So welcome again. I hope everybody is doing well. I hope you are joining us from all over the world. So as you can see here in my presentation, many of us already have already joined us on the Mastering Mobility series, in which we have focused on many different topics. Today we will focus on informal transport or paratransit, and to let you know as well that we have still 2 sessions coming, and that you are also still free to register and to join us tomorrow and next week. Now, some rules to participate today. I need to remind you that this session is being recorded. If you do not want to appear in the recording, please do not turn your cameras on. So I will need to ask you to please turn your cameras off, to please use the chat if you need to ask questions, to share information, ideas. You are welcome to do so throughout the session. We will have a Q&A session in which we will answer the chat questions. Also, we will have translation services into English and French. Most of the presentations will be in English today. We will have one presentation, I think, in French. So please follow the instructions and download the translation application, especially for French-speaking people. Here are in the chat the guidance on how to access the translation services, and also we have put there the links to the presentations today that you can download already. Now we have a pretty long and tight agenda today. As you can see, we're mostly going to focus on our newest publication that we are launching today, that we would like to, and very proud to present to you today. But also we will hear from some experiences on case studies from Dakar, Senegal, and Cape Town in South Africa. So stay with us until the end. We have also an interactive activity to put into use this toolkit that we are going to present today. Now, the objectives of the session, first, we would like to share with you how to identify the steps and requirements to do a diagnosis of the paratransit sector, especially when conducting a sustainable urban mobility planning process. Also, we will present to you a catalog of 50 measures on how to reform, how to improve the sector, to reduce its externalities, and to improve on its benefits. And also, we would like to discuss with you also to reflect on how to implement these measures in your city, in your cities. Now, we have many experts from different organizations today. We have Anne from the French Development Agency. We have Clément Musil from MobiliseYourCity Asia, Solène Baffi from Codatu, Reginald Springleer from the city of Cape Town, and Mr. Bakar Fall from Dakar, Senegal. So without further ado, because we have a long agenda, I'd like to welcome Anne, first of all. She is a transport leader from the team leader from the French Development Agency, and she will be presenting, sharing with us a short introduction and definition of paratransit. Thank you, Anne. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone, and many thanks, Matteo, for the introduction. So as a next introduction actually to the topic, I wanted to present a few slides, really introductory slides on the paratransit topic, to explain what are the main features, the main characteristics of paratransit. So it's rather well-known features, but I think it was important to highlight this feature straight away from the beginning of this session. Also, they may be well-known by most of the participants. Next slide, please. So what is paratransit? First of all, I think what is very important to keep in mind is that it's a very important model share. So in Global South, paratransit is often the main transport mode or very dominant transport mode. You can see in the figure in in the left side of the slide. So in green, it's the share of paratransit, and in blue, it's the share of formal public transport in cities per region. So you can see in some cities, it's almost 100% of the public transport that is done through paratransit, and there is almost no formal public transport. So, for example, it's the case in Algeria here. So at the top, it's North Africa. Then you have Sub-Saharan Africa when you have Cotonou, Conakry, Dar es Salaam with very significant share, Douala Yaoundé in Cameroon, and also in Asia, more at the bottom, for example, Manila, paratransit is quite important. On Latin America, at the very bottom of the figure, you can see in Lima, Santiago, it's a very important mode. So the first key feature of paratransit is that it's the bulk of public transport is in many cities of the global south. So there is no way to work on urban mobility in these cities if you are not working on paratransit. A second important feature is that it's very diverse. So you can have in terms of the type of vehicles, for example, you can have two-wheelers with with several users on the same two-wheeler. You can have three-wheelers, the rickshaw, for example, mostly in Asia, and then you can have a lot of various four-wheelers vehicles, from the station wagon, so the regular car, to minibuses or even smaller medium buses. So very, very diverse, a lot of diversity in paratransit. A third important characteristic is that it's quite flexible. So compared to a formal public transport, it can be adapted more quickly, and it's really flexible to the demand. Paratransit goes where the demand is, and is much quicker to react and much more resilient compared to a formal public transport usually. Next, please. Other important key features of paratransit globally is that something very important, I think, to keep in mind, that it's a service driven by individual short-term profitability needs. So it's not a public service per se. It's more a sector driven by private and diverse interest. So there is usually low public oversight, usually no subsidies. So that's an asset because there is no cost for the society. But at the same time, you have to develop a service with no subsidies, whereas usually public transport is it's subsidized and sometimes even heavily subsidized. So you cannot expect the same quality if you have no subsidies at all. You have to deal with multiple actors with distinct interests. So it's not the same interest if it's you are thinking about the driver, if you are thinking about the owner, if you are thinking about the public authority. Every actor has a specific interest, and you have to keep that in mind. Solène will develop that more in depth in the next session. There is generally no or low offer in unprofitable times. So, for example, at night or place where the urban setting is not very dense, for example. Services are usually not very easy to find, not predictable. So you don't know in advance at what time the vehicle will come. Based on the fill and go logic. So usually, very often the driver wait for the vehicle to be full before they go. So you don't know exactly when you will go. You enter the vehicle and you don't know when you will leave and when you will arrive at the place you want to go. And there is usually very limited information, if sometimes no information on the service. Also on the quality of vehicles on stops, terminals, usually the quality is quite low. Another important feature to keep in mind is that the service is hampered by overcost. So overcost due to technical inefficiency. For example, the fact that there is competition in the market and not competition for the market. Or for example, the fact that the vehicles are quite aged and they have an overconsumption, fuel consumption, or they are not performing well because they are not properly maintained. There are also overcosts due to corruption and sometimes due to association racketeering, and also overcosts due to high financing costs. So it's not easy for an operator who has only one or two vehicles to have access to finance at a normal or reasonable rate. Next, please. And lastly, two other important features of the paratransit, usually in Global South. First of all, it's it's a sector which provides a lot of works. Sometimes it's the number of works associated to of jobs associated to paratransit are quite sizable compared to the size of the city where they are working. But the jobs provided are usually jobs in very poor working conditions. So usually there is no contract for the staff. And the staff work on the basis of the target system. So that's one of the dominant mode of organization of paratransit, where the driver has to pay a fixed amount to the vehicle owner each day, and then he takes all the fares. So he has to have as much user as possible during the day to be able to reimburse the fixed fares he owns to the owner, and then to have a margin for itself. The drivers usually they work very long hours and they have no social protections, no day off. So the jobs conditions are usually quite poor. And a last characteristics I wanted to highlight is that the sector usually leads to negative externalities, so mostly congestion, also because it's a very fragmented sector with a lot of small-scale vehicles. Negative externalities on with regard to air quality and GHG emission, and negative externalities with regard to road safety. So that was very briefly the main features of paratransit in the Global South. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and for this brief introduction of this very diverse universe of paratransit that we can see and experience, and throughout the world in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. So now I think somebody wrote in the chat that that data is 15 years or old from your presentation, and so data, I wanted to say data is a precious asset in the paratransit sector and very difficult to come by. And I think now the presentation from Solène, a project manager from Codatu, one of the main authors of this publication that we are launching, will share perhaps some insights on how to conduct a diagnosis. So Solène, welcome, and thank you. You can start now.
Thank you very much, Matteo. Yes, indeed, we will tackle this issue as well. And as you recalled, so this first presentation is on one of the two parts of the document that will be launched today on understanding the paratransit and how to conduct a diagnosis. Sorry, I can hear the translator, so it's a bit weird. Okay, that's better. So this publication has been prepared by Jean-Pierre Lannes from Esperia and myself. And one of the main approach we wanted to present of the paratransit sector is not just the transport sector itself, the services produced, but also the ecosystem of actors that underlie the whole sector. Next, please. So as you can see here, we tried to retrace to the ecosystem of actors. So as Anne recalled, the paratransit sector employed many people with different jobs. One central job is actually the driver, with connection with different other actors. And all these actors interact according to their own interest and the onset of arbitration, depending on their goals, of course, which makes it a very complex system to understand, and of course, a very complex system to reform. And one particular aspect as well of the paratransit sector is that it's often a very political sector. Very political because of its economic weight. Again, we mentioned the number of jobs that are present in the sector. Also because of the importance of the cash flows that are generated in the sector. And also the strong corruption associated with sometimes with this cash flows, and also sometimes some political power of some of the actors present in the sector. So all of this makes it very important prior to any action on the sector to really understand precisely the interaction between each different stakeholder, and also what are their own interests and what are their own goals and set of constraints to make sure that the possible reform would be socially acceptable by all and actually useful for all. So one possible set of questions to ask once conducting a diagnosis, so that's next slide, please, focus on the different types of relationship identified between the actors. So one main question to ask beforehand is, first of all, to describe the transport system, meaning, as Anne recalled, there is many different cities where the paratransit sector is present in the world, but sometimes with different functions and sometimes with a different size. So in some cities, there is only the paratransit proposing transport services. In some other cities, it's a complementary offer with other public transport services. In some situations, there are some ways of regulating the sector, whereas in other cities, it's still a widely unregulated service. So depending on this first type of situation, that will have an impact on the kind of diagnosis that can be implemented, and then the solutions and actions that can be implemented. Then first question regard how is managed the business risk. And by asking this question, it's actually the relationship between the driver of the vehicle and the owner, when it's not the same person, that one wants to understand. And behind that is, of course, the business model of the sector, which is at stake. Another set of questions regard how is the sector regulated. And in this set of questions, one can draw specific attention on the relationship between the local government, the operator, and the professional organization when they exist and when they are involved in the regulation of the sector. Then another set of questions regard the facilities and how they are managed, because this is also one observation from many cities where the paratransit service is present, that sometimes the service is actually regulated from the stops and the stations. So it's also really important to draw attention to where the operators are gathering and how this is impacting the way the service is organized, and also, of course, the way it is integrated in the public space. Then another set of questions regard the role of the passenger, because of course the demand is a key component of any diagnosis. And more specifically, what is the socio-economic profile of the users? Because in some situations, users can be captive passengers. They do not have a choice, either because they do not have the financial means to use other transport offer, or because, as we said earlier, there is no other transport offers. But in other cities, like for instance in Asian cities, there exists as well a premium kind of paratransit service offer, which is targeted to the middle class, for instance. So this is a completely different kind of service that needs to be identified as well in diagnosis. And eventually, another important set of questions regard the performances and inefficiencies of the system. The performances regard all the positive externalities, explaining why the paratransit sector exists, why it is maintained, and why there is still a demand, and sometimes a growing demand, and also what are the inefficiencies of the system. So Anne recalled that as well in a former presentation, that there are also a lot of hidden costs or unforeseen costs associated with the paratransit sector. May it be, for instance, the cheap manpower, which is also not, of course, ideal, but also sometimes in the business model, there are many different items that are not considered as per se by the different operators, such as, for instance, as well, the flows of the financial flows linked to corruption. So next slide, please. One methodology that is suggested in the document Understanding the Paratransit Sector is to to make a diagnosis based on 4 different components, meaning, first of all, the offer and the supply, which is, of course, the basic characteristics of any service. So what is the transport offer? And again, the demand. The business model, as we saw that it has a very important impact on the relationship between the different set of actors. And that's also where most of the time there is a lack of information. And the structures and organizations. And this aspect is also really important, first of all, to understand again the logic behind the different groups of actors, but also in the perspective of a reform to know on which kind of organization, on which stakeholder it will be necessarily to also it will be necessary to include in the reform. So after identifying these 4 components, different sources can be used to fill in the diagnosis. So we try to be as exhaustive as possible, but of course this has to be adapted to each context. And of course, one of the main obstacle with the paratransit sector is most of the time the lack of data. And this is also something that is, of course, one of the reasons why this graphic from 2015 was already very difficult to make and to compile based on different sources, and why it's also very difficult to readapt and to renew this type of graphic, because the data is always missing. And one key aspect that we wanted to emphasize in this document is also that most of the time the point is not to have the most accurate as possible data, but to have like a range of an idea of the range of operators, for instance, or numbers. So sometimes it's much more important to cross-check sources than to look for the most precise data. Eventually, one outcome of the diagnosis, and this is in the next slide, is to understand for each stakeholder what are the positive and the negative externalities of the sector and the services. So one possible outcome of the diagnosis that we suggest in the document is to build a SWOT analysis, but a SWOT analysis declined with each type of actor, meaning at least for the users, the drivers, and the owners, when they are not the same actors, and the local government. Then can be also more stakeholders, but these are the let's say the key stakeholders in the system. And the point is to understand for each why is the service valuable and what needs to be reformed to minimize, to mitigate the negative externalities. And through that, there are several objectives, overall goals, which are first of all to identify win-win solutions, which means like levers that can be used to really facilitate to improve the service for all different kinds of actors. Also socially acceptable solutions, as we saw also earlier. Paratransit sector is a very political sector, so it's also really important to be able to implement socially acceptable measures. And then the SWOT analysis also give keys to prioritize the types of actions that can be implemented, because many reforms can, through a reform, many actions can be implemented, but of course, not all of them will have the same range of priority. And then, so the final slide, please. All of that having in mind all the overall goals that were recalled earlier by Anne, which are having more efficient paratransit services, meaning improving transport service, and also improving especially a service which would be more user-oriented, because in most of the cities at the moment, it's not really the case. Improve working conditions, especially for the drivers and the operators in general, who most of the time overcome very precarious working conditions, and improve air quality and more sustainable cities in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Solène, for this very interesting presentation. So I think we haven't given a proper introduction to the two publications that, two documents that we are presenting to you today. So all of this information that you have heard is in our new publication on paratransit. Let me just quickly share my screen to show you that you can download this publication on how to conduct a diagnosis in the paratransit. It includes a definition of the paratransit sector, all of this information that Solène presented to you. Just go to our website and you can download these two presentations. The next publication will be on the measures to reform paratransit. So it's already available in the website. We will post the links in the chat. So feel free to download the documents and check them out. Now, the next presentation will be by Clément Musil, our colleague from MobiliseYourCity Asia, and he will be presenting very shortly the outlook of paratransit in Asia. Welcome, Clément.
Thank you, Matteo. Good afternoon to everyone. So my presentation is based on the work that we are currently conducting in Asia for MobiliseYourCity Asia with Codatu, with Espelia, and under the supervision of AFD. So this work aims at producing a paper on paratransit and with a diagnosis, with the same approach that Solène described, but also to provide some operational recommendation. So next, please. So one of the first aspects of paratransit in Asia must be related to the urban context. So if during the 80s, public policies were oriented towards construction of expressway, a shift occurred, and cities started to plan mass rapid transit systems and got access to finance to build those infrastructure. So a clear acceleration of the number of BRT, MRT occurs in the last decade. Next, please. City in the developing and emerging Asia is also known for a high usage of motorbike. It's true in Vietnam, it's true in Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia. In terms of paratransit, it means that two-wheelers are an important option as the vehicle are easily accessible and also affordable. Next. Here, a glimpse of the paratransit situation. You can see that 2 3-wheelers are dominating. So in the big cities, paratransit service is serving mainly the last kilometer. Why? Because there is MRT, BRT. However, the situation is different in smaller cities where the vehicles with higher passenger capacities are mainly operated. Next, please. So with this overview of paratransit modal share, we see that the share in Asia, comparing with African cities or South American cities, it's less important, but it raises a serious question: the need of accurate and comparable data about paratransit. Next, please. So one of the key dynamics that give a certain specificity to a paratransit in Asia is the development and the use of digital tools. Why it is occurring in Asia? It's because there is a high penetration of mobile internet use with the smartphone. But it paved this situation paved the way to the rapid development of tools as the ride-hailing apps. So in 2017, there was around 80 apps identified since new ones were launched on the market. In Southeast Asia, Grab is a major player. It absorbs even Uber, and it's covering more than 340 cities in 8 countries. The use of apps come also with the use of e-wallet and cashless payment system. So that 2 things can be mentioned with this new system, with e-wallet and cashless payment system. First, the apps operator are paying tax, like the VAT, so there is more transparency. Second, apps company are also providing some financial services as affordable loans for small services. So it means that they are providing loans to buy vehicles. Next. Another key aspect is in the region is the stimulate by the access of new technologies. So on one hand, there is the possibility to upgrade and adapt the vehicle with a cleaner solution, LPG, CNG. On the other hand, Asia is also the region where the production of e-vehicles is important. Very soon in India, half of the new three-wheelers that will be sold will be electric vehicles. So as the technology is available in Asia, the number of registered vehicle, 2 and 3 EV, that can be used as a paratransit vehicle are growing. So this expansion is not only the result of the market. At the national level, the states are also adapting their policies and set up some incentives to encourage the development and the use of electric vehicles. Next, please. I will just conclude here, to be brief, that currently in our work, so the paratransit paper in Asia, we are elaborating operational recommendations that are targeting 3 levels: the national level, the local level, with recommendations that can be used in a sump or without a sump. And at the project level, that means when there is a mass rapid transit system that is planned or under development. We are also providing and try to provide some recommendations that can be used for the paratransit players. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Clément, again for this very quick introduction into the topic in Asia. So I want to ask you to please keep your camera on, because we are going to have a very short Q&A session with Anne, Solène, and Clément. So we have already received a couple of questions. If you have any questions or remarks, feel free to ask them in the chat. So first of all, I would like to ask, we have received a couple of questions, and thank you very much. So again, I'd like to ask perhaps first, one of you, Solène, Anne, or Clément, Aman was asking that, well, data is very important, but what type of data and for what purposes perhaps should we perhaps prioritize in context where we don't have really much resources or where data is scarce? Where should we be looking and for what purposes? Who wants to answer
Maybe
that
on
question?
this one, for me, what is really key is to have a complete picture of all the stakeholders involved in the sector, and to have a complete picture of the cash flow distribution in the sector and the distribution of power, and also to identify the possible overcost in sectors. For me, that's really the key and the key of any diagnosis and the basis for possible reform in the system. Without this comprehensive understanding of the sector, I think it's really not possible to design any reform for paratransit.
Thank you very much, Anne. Solène, Clément, do you want to add something or?
Completely agreed with Anne. I think identifying the stakeholders is the first and main step.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Now another question by Nicolas, also on the same side. So in many cities there are different types of services. We have minibuses operating on semi-fixed routes. We have on-demand taxi services. So when doing a diagnosis, in cities where perhaps we have these 2 types of services, do we need to keep these 2 services apart when doing the diagnosis, and what should we be differentiating, making differently for each service? Solène, would you like to?
Yeah, I can go for this one, no problem. This is really important, because when we talk about paratransit, we're talking about very different kind of services, and sometimes they also coexist in the same city. So that's why also in the understanding paratransit document, you will find a matrix where we try to also give some clues on how to categorize the different kind of paratransit services. And I think it's also indeed essential to really make make a difference between those types of services, because within the case of a reform, they won't need the same type of actions. And also, it's not always the same kind of stakeholders that are involved. It's not necessarily the same business models as well. So to really have an in-depth understanding of the sector and what can be done, the positive and negative externalities, it is then really important to make like a diagnosis, including all these kind of services.
Thank you very much, Solène. And perhaps one last question for Clément from my side. So you've shared with us that in Asia you are seeing an explosion of digital services that are helping also digitalize and gather data from the paratransit sector. And also we are seeing that the e-vehicle fleets for two-wheelers are increasing dramatically, also in India especially. So perhaps looking to Africa and Latin America, what is Asia doing perhaps right that or that Latin America and Africa are perhaps missing a bit from these two sides? Can you share something with us?
I don't know what they are doing right or in difference. However, there is this flourishing, booming activities. Just if you want for the app activity. It comes also with everything, the service, like the delivery and all that. So it's, and especially during this period of COVID, it was a necessity for a lot of people. So I mean, there is also this the context, but also the availability of the technology. After that, about the e-vehicles, it's very interesting because in the region, when I'm saying in the region, we have India that is producing a lot of e-vehicles, China as well. But after that, often the question that is raised, it's also where does come from the electricity, and because of course the EV are there in order to reduce GHG emission and all that, but it's that also the next big question in the region. It's nice to have the production of those vehicles. It's nice to have those vehicles now in the streets, in the market, and also more and more affordable. However, the big question is still there. Where does come from the main source of energy?
Thank you very much, you three, for your answers. So I am going to continue with the agenda. We will have another Q&A because the other questions are regarding more the practical side, and we are going to discuss now the practical aspects of improving paratransit, especially answering the question of what governments can do, especially. So again, Solène will be presenting again. So Solène, go ahead.
Yes. Thank you. And maybe with the PowerPoint, if you still have it, Matteo. Perfect.
Give me 1 second.
So just to pitch, so I will present to you now the second part of the document, which is the second phase. So after doing the diagnosis, what kind of actions can be implemented? So we proposed a series of actions that can be used by policymakers and practitioners. And so I briefly will come back on the methodology, how we came out with this 50+ actions, and also the spirit of this action. So how they can be used, why they've been identified with the hierarchy they are presented in the document, and also what is the philosophy behind the document itself. So first slide, please. To briefly come back on the methodology of the toolbox that is now available. So the idea was to, after the diagnosis, give clues on what to do and how to facilitate the implementation of actions within the case of a reform. And again, this can be within the frame of a SUMP reform, but also without the frame of a SUMP reform. So to elaborate this toolbox, we privileged a co-constructive methodology, meaning that after the diagnosis, we looked for different kind of actions that have already been implemented worldwide, and we tried to gather them in different type of actions, and then through two webinars, we presented this kind of actions to decision makers and policy makers, and we tried to either get that feedback if they actually implemented the action in their own city, or why this would be relevant or not in their own context, and what else could be implemented. So after this discussion, we could enrich, we could modify, we could update the first catalog of actions. So you can see it was a collaborative document that we shared online during the process, and come out with the document that is today available. So the idea is to present different kind of actions that can be implemented à la carte, meaning that they don't all have to be implemented, and especially not at the same time. And they need to be implemented according to the needs identified through the diagnosis, according to the means locally available, and to the overall goals that can be identified in the SUMP or without a SUMP as well. Those tools are obviously adaptive. They are broad tools. They are really meant to be an inspiration or a frame, but they are not a recipe. Let's put it this way. And they are progressive, meaning that some actions are actions that are essential to really build a reform on, and some actions are more long-term actions that can be implemented to really support a global reform. Next slide, please. So you can see that all these different kind of actions, all these actions, so the 50 actions have been then declined within 4 different steps, which recall the SUMP cycle to make it relevant when there is actually a SUMP process already implemented. And these actions have been then divided, so with preparing the reform stage, reforming the sector stage, supporting the reform of the paratransit sector, and ensuring the implementation. So depending on the stage, the actions won't have the same priority, and also they won't call for the same means. So it's important to have in mind that it's really a logic of a progressive logic that undermine the document. So now I'd like to present to you specific actions for each steps, just to give you an idea either of the spirit of the document, how it has been built, and what you can get from it, or also the logic of the actions that are presented in it. So first, the next slide, please. One kind of action that is a preliminary kind of action is survey. And I think it's also interesting that you were mentioning before the lack of data, because this is one of the action that needs to be implemented, of course, to prepare the reform, to identify who are the actors and who are the stakeholders, how many they are, etc. So, for instance, for this action, we proposed a methodology for which all the steps, for instance, presented on the screen can be implemented or not. So, for instance, in several cities now we see that GPS tracking is more and more possible, which allows then to create a database with the numbers of operators, but also the routes used by the operator. And that can be also turned out into a real-time passenger information database in the most sophisticated cases. But even without reaching this step, the information collected can be strategic at different levels. First of all, to identify and formalize the operators, also to acknowledge the paratransit offer, which is also a very important step to prepare for reform, to say that the point is also to work with the operators. It's also a very powerful planning tool, of course, to know where the routes and what area are connected or not. And it can be, of course, a useful passenger information tool over the long term. Next slide, please. Another kind of action. Sorry, next slide. Another kind of action which is really important is structure, meaning identify who are the professional organization existing in the sector and to support the creation when they do not exist, and to make sure that they also evolve according to a democratic process, meaning that, of course, it's really essential to have stakeholders that local government will be able to deal with within the case of a reform. So that's why this is one of the most important action within the reforming the sector stage. And also what I wanted to show was these two different actions, that the point is not just to say that you need to have someone to interact with. It's also guaranteeing that this process can be a long-term process, and also that those professional organizations are representative of the sector and all the different operators. That's why the democratic function is also a very key element to make sure that the dialogue is possible, and it can be a long-lasting relationship that is being built between the local authorities and the operators. Then, when reforming the sector, another kind of action which is really important, next slide, please, is the plan actions, meaning defining the function of the paratransit in the public transport system, which is, of course, one of the main outcomes after the diagnosis. After figuring out what is the role of the paratransit, then it's also what can be the role within the reform according to the goal of, for instance, improving intermodality, improving access to all citizens, etc. And this is also a key step to make sure that there is a good understanding of what is the cost of the reform and what can be the long-term strategy to reform the paratransit. So this is also now with this specific focus on the action. This is an extract of the document. You can see that for each type of action, there are also a certain amount, specific indicators, such as the prerequisites that are needed, the stakeholders involved in the action, the level of effort for the local authorities, the level of importance of the action, the point of focus, especially when the measures have already implemented in some cities and there were some spillover effects that have been identified, and also the assessment that can be made of the action, meaning the evaluation criteria to make sure that there is a way to control how the implementation of the action can be monitored. And this is also an important point for each action. When possible, we try to suggest cities where the action or a similar project has been implemented, not to say that this is what to do, but to give an inspiration and sometimes also to look for what has been done, and also to have a better understanding of sometimes also what worked and what did not necessarily work completely or not as expected, because this is also a very important source of learnings. So now with the next slide, I wanted to show a much more in-depth set of actions, also which are at the heart of the reform themselves, meaning the kind of agreement that can be implemented between the operators and the local government. And of course, this will depending on the context of the relationship between the operators and the local government. This will depend also on the means that the local government have access to. But for each kind of agreement, there will be the same philosophy is suggested, meaning defining conditions and advantages granted within the agreement. So, for instance, when it comes to labelizing, the idea is not to have many obligations for the operator, but to give access to an acknowledgement of the service granted, the quality of the service that will help the passenger, and that will be a first step for the local authority to make a census of the existing operators. Then through the authorization kind of agreement, there is another step in terms of obligations and advantages. It can be, for instance, in terms of obligations, the obligation to buy or get a license and permit, but also specifications to respect. But the counterpart would be to have also legal operations, a more visible service, and less competition. And the more advanced stage would be, of course, the contractualization, which means also for the operators sharing the risk with the local government, but also having much more obligations. And for each type of agreement, which is detailed in the document, the idea is always to give examples of the kind of conditions and obligations and advantages that can be granted, and also to define the procedures and the conditions to renew the agreement, because of course the idea is also to have a long-lasting perspective and to have a long-term reform. Also, what was important for us, so this is the next slide, was also to introduce actions that are not necessarily costly. And this is a very quick example of that regarding actions that concern pricing, which is also really a complex topic, and it's very challenging because, of course, it entails working on a business model for operators, so it's always a very sensitive question. The point here of the actions that are suggested is not necessarily to rely on very sophisticated and technological tools, but rather to have very basic, very pragmatic approaches to start the dialogue with the operators. And I think that would be also something that will be then tackled within the Dakar case study. So I won't say more now. And another important point, yes, thank you, that we wanted to emphasize in the document is also the necessity to implement win-win solutions. So the example I wanted to show for this in the supporting the reform stage is the professionalization of operators, which on the one hand, of course, the point is to improve the quality of the service and to also capitalize on the operator's knowledge, meaning that it's not only providing support for the operators, but it also gaining for their insight on the industry and on the understanding of the sector. So this is like the kind of win-win measures that can be implemented. And I think the Cape Town case study will be actually also quite interesting to maybe elaborate on this aspect. Eventually, last example to again emphasize another important point. Next slide, please. Is that these actions need, of course, to be implemented, but they also need to be enforced. And this is also a set of actions that we suggest in the ensuring the implementation stage. So different actions are suggested, and they have with the idea that, of course, if there is no control, then it's very tricky to guarantee that the regulation is actually respected and enforced locally. But it's also really important to prevent informal practices, as we know that it is also one of the main externalities of the paratransit sector. So the point through this set of actions is also to guarantee the long-term effect of the reform with the enforcement, but also to make sure that the legal framework is fair for all stakeholders over the long term. And to conclude, next slide, I just wanted to sum up that all these type of actions can be then understood as levers with very specific outcomes that are expected and that can be connected to overall goals. And it's really important to have in mind what lever can be used to implement what kind of action within the ambition to reach overall goals. However, it's really important, and that's why it's really this is really the goal of the diagnosis. It's really important to have in mind that actions can have spillover effects, like for instance, obligations on licenses can create like a black market where people trade those licenses at a higher price, for instance. So that's why it's really important to keep this systematic approach when trying to understand the paratransit sector and trying to reform the paratransit sector, to make sure that all the possible outcomes and spillover effects are well considered, and that it can be a more sustainable, the most sustainable as possible reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Solène, for this very interesting presentation. Again, as Solène, what Solène has shared is only a small piece of the entire catalog of measures, and then you're encouraged to download the document and see all of them for yourself. We have already many answers, many questions received that we will answer in the Q&A after the next two presentations. So our next presentation is going to be by Reginald. I'm going to, because we have two presentations on case studies, and one of the presentations will be in French by Ababakar Fall. And I wanted to give the English speakers a bit of time so you can download the application and set up the translation services. So in the meanwhile, I'm going to ask, please, Reginald to present first and then Ababakar later. If that is okay for you, Ababakar and Reginald.
Thank you, that's fine for me.
Perfect.
May I present my screen?
Yes, you are welcome to present your screen. Otherwise, I can do it for you. Just let me know.
Thank you.
Perfect. We can see your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Reginald Springleer. I'm a city official for the city of Cape Town. And I was asked to present the Cape Town case study, particularly on the transport operating company pilot project that we were involved in. Just basically, I'm going to take the audience through some key facts in Cape Town, just to give some context. I want to talk briefly about definitions and objectives and some key lessons that we have learned in our BRT system called My City in Cape Town. Then I'm going to go talk around the minibus taxi transformation model, and then the pilot project video. I don't think we will have time. It's just a video clip that I have, but we won't have time to show that. So just some key facts. Cape Town population, we estimating at about 4.7 million people. In terms of our public transport or paratransit network, we have rail, which is the backbone of our paratransit, but our current rail system is in a state of failure. Then we have scheduled buses, which called Golden Arrow Bus Services, and they are subsidized by government. We have our My City BRT, which is city contracted through grant funding. Minibus taxis in Cape Town, we estimate about 12,000 legal licensed operators and plus minus 5,000 illegal operators. Then we have meter taxis, which is in a state, in my view, is in a state of decline as a result of the growing e-hailing services. In Cape Town, we have many licensed as well as unlicensed e-hailing services. And then in parts of Cape Town, we have these sedan taxis, the 3+1. In Cape Town, we have a name for them. We call them amapelas, and very few of them are licensed. So those are some key facts, just to give some context. And then just in terms of definition, I like to use this definition in our minibus taxi context. I draw a distinction between transition versus transformation. And in our minibus taxi context, I refer to transition as the replacement of minibus taxi operators and establishing formal bus operators like our MyCity and just replacing them. And we form vehicle operating companies. We have provisions for compensation or buyout of existing operators, where they can use that compensation and buy shares into the formal companies. So that is what I refer to as transition. Then transformation is basically referring to transforming the broader minibus taxi industry to give effect to legislative provisions such as the reform that we're talking about. And the purport from legislation is basically to improve passenger experiences, to give effect to empowerment, and I think Solène was touching on it, the capacity building strategies. That is basically just the wording of what I've said. So when you download the slides, you will be able to read through that. I'm not going to read through that. Just some lessons that we have learned in our transformation and transition strategies or projects. We learned that it's not always desirable to replace all minibus taxis with the formal MyCity buses. And we found, especially on feeders, that the minibus taxis can offer more frequent and flexible services. The minibus taxi operators also understand the user preference. And we also learned that it's not cost effective for MyCity to offer the same services as the smaller vehicles. And then obviously a big lesson that we have learned is the enforcement challenges that we encountered. Another lesson that we learned was through the limited funding availability, we needed to consider other alternatives. In our MyCity model, we replaced all minibus taxis. But going further, we've learned in rolling out further phases, we've learned that we need to consider a combination of minibus taxi and MyCity services, especially on feeder routes. And we would like to call this the hybrid model. But in doing or giving effect to a hybrid model, we acknowledge that transformation of the existing minibus taxi industry is required, because many characteristics are synonymous with the minibus taxi industry: bad taxi driver behavior, the negative passenger experiences, are some of it, overcrowding, poor quality vehicles, and unmanaged public transport interchanges or taxi ranks. So we asking the question, what if a reformed taxi can offer recapitalized vehicles? What if it can offer driver training and accreditation, reduce pressure on limited enforcement capacity? What if the right size vehicles can be dispatched based on the demand for the service per route, as well as what if they can manage the capacity of the PTIs through technology, etc.? And then in terms of our MyCity brand, what if they can offer the same look and feel? We believe those characteristics, if they can offer that there's a place in the paratransit reform for us in Cape Town. So that gave birth to this TOC project that we embarked on, or Transport Operating Company. And this project just really came about based on some influencing factors, such as the experience that we've gained in the planning and implementation of our BRT system. We had a phase 1 and Into Express. And through those two projects, we were learning very valuable lessons again. And we needed to apply that lessons in the planning and implementation of the next phase that we are going into, our phase 2, while acknowledging also the challenges that comes with it. And then obviously, as many governments, but especially in developing countries, the funding constraints or the budget cuts and the funding parameters was also an influencing factor for us to look outside of the box, so to say. I'm not going to talk about this for the purpose of this meeting, but this is just what we can achieve through an interchange management entity. So what we came up with in our development of our TOC, we found some benefits that if we develop this TOC, we found that a benefit is that the passengers are better dealt with. Their concerns are better dealt with in terms of safety from accidents, the behavior of drivers, overcrowding and roadworthiness. And we also found that another benefit is there's better opportunities for the operator. There's potential for more profits. There's opportunities for more new businesses, because new companies are always looking for reputable companies to enter into business with. We found that they're then positioned to enter into contracts and then also positioned to receive subsidy from government. So those are some of the benefits. Then moving straight into the pilot model that we have developed. So we have one taxi association in one of our suburbs called 7th Avenue Taxi Association. And these are just some of the business improvements that we obtained during that pilot. We were able to move this informal taxi service to a more scheduled service. We reduced the fleet requirements from 78 vehicles to 37 vehicles. They were able to continue to employ all drivers, the 78 drivers, so to say. The drivers then changed into a new shift working, and they were able to get a day off per week. The driver's salary was on par with what they earned before, and we were also able to restructure the routes, and we were able to amend the routes to better see to the passenger needs. In the business plan that we developed, we started this pilot in January 2019, and our business plan, we did projections over a 16-year period just to show how it can be sustained, and it doesn't need subsidy going forward. This slide I'm not going to talk about, but you can read it at your leisure. Just showing a table how we, in our pilot model, how we did the fleet replacement or renewal, fleet renewal model. That slide just shows how we can achieve that fleet recapitalization. So basically, just summarizing that business plan, our 8 and 16-year financial plan showed that the operating cost of the service can be covered by the revenue generated from fares. This would allow the current license holder or the TOC shareholders, which they would become if they form into a TOC, to earn on average the same profit that they are earning in the informal way. Our plan also showed that the TOC will require financial assistance with the once-off setup cost from a government grant or funding, as well as with the recapitalization of the new fleet. And the emphasis there is on the once-off setup cost. In terms of scalability, we also needed to do an exercise to see if this can be replicated over other associations. In Cape Town, we have 102 taxi associations. And our replicability or scalability exercise showed that basically just 30% of all the associations, so 30 out of the 102, proved from a desktop analysis, proved to be candidates for a viable TOC. But key to that work is, does the association or the operators have appetite? Is there willingness, and does their structure allow for a conversion to a TOC? Finally, just in terms of the efficiency measures that we introduced, showed that good improvement for both the drivers, the owners, and more importantly, the passengers. The business plan for 7th Avenue pilot showed that the improvements can be sustained, but like I said previously, provided that there is assistance for setup costs and recapitalization of fleet. And the results of our pilot show that, like I said, between 25 and 30% can be rolled out across the associations in our city. Just some further work. We acknowledge that we need to just get government support so that the TOC model can be replicated. I can report that in our context, our national government is very much on board, and there's this urgency to give effect to the TOC project in Cape Town. We also need to move the 7th Avenue pilot model to the next step of actually, like I said, and as you know, it's a pilot project, so we want to move it into a permanent state, and that would require that the single operators need to transfer their licenses and vehicles to the company in exchange for shareholding. And just finally, the case for implementing the TOC model, we're saying from a government perspective, there is urgent need, I think, across the world for minibus taxi improvement interventions. And in our case, the city invested much in terms of our transition and transformation strategies. We also, from a government perspective, it also showing that implementing these initiatives, minibus taxi reforms, it has the potential to reduce taxi violence and conflict. From a minibus taxi industry perspective, there is a need for government financial support. And I think, in my experience, the minibus taxi, they're tired of this taxi violence and conflict, and they show some willingness to comply. We have two pilot or two short-term initiatives as a result of COVID in the taxi industry. It's called the Red Dot and Blue Dot. And that also showed the extent to which formalization has the potential in this informal market. That's my story. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Reginald, for sharing your experience today with us. I'd like to ask you to please stay with us a bit longer, and we will have some questions for you in the Q&A after next presentation. Thank you again. And now our next presentation will be in French by Ababakar Fall. He will share with us his experience in Dakar, Senegal. So for the next 10 minutes, we will shift to French, and then we will shift back to English. Thank you, Ababakar, for joining us, and the floor is yours. Please let me know if I should share your presentation. We cannot hear you still. You need to unmute yourself. Now we can hear you. Should we present your presentation, Ababakar?
I think he said yes.
Okay.
Okay. Merci. Je vais vous présenter un peu les réformes qui ont été menées à Dakar dans le cadre dans l'objectif de professionnaliser le secteur informel. On a commencé depuis 2005 quand même. Et on a des résultats mitigés, même si nous continuons toujours sur la même lancée. Suivant. Donc, dans un premier temps, oui, suivant.
Next slide.
OK, merci. Dans un premier temps, je vais présenter le contexte global de la mobilité à Dakar. Dans un deuxième temps, je vais montrer comment on a utilisé un programme de renouvellement du parc en réalité qui était juste un prétexte pour l'État du Sénégal pour amener les opérateurs à collaborer avec nous pour pouvoir mettre en place une professionnalisation dans le vrai objectif. Et je vais présenter la situation de ce programme-là et les perspectives. Next slide. Merci. En fait, au niveau Dakar, comme vous le voyez sur la carte, est une péninsule, une presqu'île qui a 550 km². Aujourd'hui, on a plus de 23% de la population sénégalaise des zones urbaines qui vit à Dakar. Et en 2005, on était à 2,6 millions d'habitants. On prévoit d'être 5 millions à Dakar en 2030. La capitale grandit de 100 000 habitants environ par année, avec 50% de la population urbaine. Next slide. Next. Voilà. On a fait une enquête ménage en 2005 qui a fait ressortir que on a en 2015, on est à 25 véhicules pour 1000 habitants, 7,2 millions de voyages, de passages, de déplacements par jour à Dakar, dont les 110% se font par la marche à pied, le reste se fait par le transport public. Maintenant, sur les 30% restants, on a 80% qui se fait par transport public et seulement 20% avec des véhicules individuels. Next. Je ne vais pas trop m'appesantir sur la présentation, ça montre un peu l'importance que nous avons dans le transport dans le système. Et next.
Excusez-moi, Monsieur Ababakar, est-ce que vous pouvez éteindre votre caméra parce que la connexion n'est pas parfaite?
Ah, d'accord, d'accord, merci.
Merci.
Vous me voyez mieux? Next. On a la part des clandos, on les appelle ici les clandos, tout ce qui est car, clando et express bus, c'est du transport informel. Ils ont une part de plus de presque 40% de part de marché à Dakar. On a le bus de la société publique Dakar. En bleu jaune, en bleu blanc, c'est le bus du projet de renouvellement. En bleu jaune et en blanc, les deux qui sont à droite, c'est les bus informels à Dakar. On les appelle les bleus jaunes, les cars rapides, et le blanc, on l'appelle les Ndiaganiaï. Et on a le transport de banlieue qui est le train de banlieue qui est carrément à droite. C'est les différents modes de transport aujourd'hui que nous avons à Dakar. L'objectif du projet, c'est de faire passer les bleus, jaunes et les blancs, là, les cars rapides et les Ndiaganiaï, les transformer dans un segment que nous contrôlons plus, que nous essayons de personnaliser, c'est ce que nous appelons les affûts. Next. Donc, on a des véhicules de 25 à 45 places qui ont plus de 28 ans d'âge. Ces véhicules-là, on a un secteur très fragmenté avec 1294 opérateurs recensés sur les 2558 véhicules. Il y a 1294 propriétaires. Chacun y allait à sa manière. Le secteur bancaire ne faisait pas forcément confiance à ces opérateurs-là qui étaient obligés de faire beaucoup d'efforts pour accéder au crédit. On a deux grands opérateurs de transport qui sont le bus et le train. C'est dans ce contexte-là qu'on a dit comment adapter la gouvernance, donc comment adapter la gouvernance des transports par rapport à cette réalité-là. On a introduit deux modes de transport de masse aujourd'hui, c'est le TER à Dakar qui doit rouler normalement d'ici la fin de l'année et le BRT que nous sommes en train de mettre en œuvre qui est prévu de rouler en 2023. En attendant, depuis 2005, nous travaillons sur comment organiser le transport informel et le professionnaliser. Pour cela, en fait, on s'est appuyé sur un programme de renouvellement du parc. C'est comme ça que nous l'appelons ici à Dakar. Ce programme a deux composantes. Le premier, c'est remplacer les cars rapides, les bus bleus jaunes là et les bus blancs, les remplacer par des minibus qui respectent beaucoup plus les règles et essayer de professionnaliser les acteurs à travers le renforcement des capacités, à travers leur organisation. Next.
Excusez-moi, est-ce que vous avez une possibilité d'améliorer le son ou, parce que on vous entend pas très bien.
Ok, excusez-moi.
Merci.
Non.
Pas trop, non?
Oui, vous m'entendez mieux? Allô, allô?
Ça va, merci.
Ça va, ok. En fait, ce qui a été fait, on a regroupé l'ensemble de ces opérateurs autour de 14 GIE, c'est les groupements d'intérêt économique pour les transporteurs, et on les a fédérés à travers une association qu'on a appelée AFTU, c'est l'association de financement des professionnels du transport urbain AFTU. On a commencé à prendre les cars rapides et à les remplacer par des minibus. Quand on remplace les cars rapides et les minibus, on met de nouvelles règles. Les cars rapides qui avaient la latitude de circuler partout à Dakar se sont vus maintenant assignés sur des lignes. On a mis des lignes, on a mis un niveau de service, on a mis des horaires, des horaires pour le début de service et pour la fin de service. On a délégué la gestion de ces lignes à ces GIE-là. Pour les accompagner dans le financement de leur activité, on a mis en place une mutuelle d'épargne et de crédit qui leur appartient, que nous encadrons, qui leur permet un peu de leur mettre des crédits pour la maintenance, de leur mettre des crédits pour leur apport quand il s'agit d'accéder au crédit, etc. Et on a mis une mutuelle sociale Transvie qui les accompagne comme une assurance maladie pour les travailleurs qui travaillent dans le secteur. Next. Donc, comment ça se passe concrètement? En fait, l'opérateur, il vient avec son ancien véhicule qui est cassé. L'État rachète son ancien véhicule en lui donnant ce qu'on appelle une prime à la casse. Ensuite, on lui donne un nouveau véhicule, un nouveau minibus. Il va faire un apport de 25%. Le reste du véhicule, il va le payer sur 5 ans. Il faut rappeler que le programme pilote a été financé par la Banque mondiale et depuis lors, avec l'État, il a été mis en place un fonds revolving qui permet à partir des remboursements qui se font effectuer de continuer le programme. Donc, les opérateurs vont rembourser. Ce remboursement, on le capitalise pour prendre d'autres engagements au niveau des banques, pour acheter d'autres véhicules pour donner aux opérateurs. C'est comme ça que le programme s'est autonomisé. Next. Donc, concrètement, comment ça se passe? On a la définition de la politique, la régulation, l'industrialisation du secteur, les garanties de financement qui sont données par l'État. On a un partenaire industriel parce que tous les véhicules de ce programme sont montés au Sénégal, qui importent les kits, qui montent les véhicules. Ces véhicules-là sont donnés aux opérateurs de transport qui les payent sur 5 ans. Et on a un partenaire financier qui nous accompagne dans l'arrangement des financements qu'on trouve au niveau des banques locales. Et tous les derniers programmes sont financés au niveau des banques commerciales. Next. Donc, en termes de levier financier, on a la mutuelle d'épargne de crédit aujourd'hui qui finance l'apport des opérateurs. Aujourd'hui, quand j'ai un ancien car rapide, je ne peux plus avoir le prétexte que je ne rentre pas dans le programme parce que je n'ai pas l'apport. L'apport est déjà donné automatiquement par ce mutuelle-là et qui finance aussi les opérateurs dans le cadre de leur exploitation. On a un fonds revolving qui est là, qui permet de poursuivre le programme. Et on a aussi le fonds de garantie au niveau GIE, comme les opérateurs sont organisés par GIE. Dans le remboursement, on a mis 3% de plus qui permet un peu, qu'on utilise un peu comme un levier financier pour parer au retard de certains ou en tout cas au défaut de paiement de certains opérateurs. Next. En termes de professionnalisation, on a organisé l'exploitation par ligne, comme je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, ce qui n'était pas évident auparavant. Aujourd'hui, les gens qui sont en banlieue sont sûrs d'avoir à disposition leur véhicule parce qu'il y a une obligation pour l'opérateur de respecter un certain nombre de règles. On a introduit le ticketing. Auparavant, l'usager donnait directement l'argent à l'apprenti. Aujourd'hui, il y a un ticket entre les deux qui nous permet un peu de retracer les activités, de retracer les statistiques sur les lignes. On a renforcement de capacité comme ce qui est montré sur la photo en bas. On fait régulièrement des séances de renforcement de capacité, des formations à l'endroit de tous les acteurs, que ce soit le chauffeur, le régulateur, tous ceux qui interviennent, en fait, ils sont formés, on délivre même des attestations pour ces gens-là. Et tout dernièrement, on a créé un GIE qui encadre un peu l'activité sur le terrain, qui coordonne les opérations au niveau de l'ensemble des véhicules et qui supervise un peu tout le personnel partagé, tout ce qui est contrôleur, régulateur, c'est CapTrans. CapTrans, en fait, aujourd'hui, fédère et coordonne l'activité pour l'ensemble des GIE sur le terrain. C'est la dernière création qui a été faite. Next. En termes de résultats, nous avons aujourd'hui pu renouveler 2100 véhicules. On a renforcé les capacités des opérateurs. On a une meilleure organisation des opérations. Par exemple, quand il y a un accident ou il y a un incident, on sait exactement, on appelle directement l'organisme qui fédère ça, il nous donne des informations sur ça. On est arrivé à formaliser progressivement les opérateurs qui ont maintenant, l'ensemble des opérateurs ont un compte auprès de Mectrans, ce qui n'était pas le cas auparavant. Et on a une meilleure satisfaction quand même des usagers. Et ils arrivent à s'autonomiser d'une part et ils arrivent aussi à rembourser. Ils arrivent à rembourser l'essentiel des crédits qui leur sont octroyés. Donc, on tend de plus en plus vers une formalisation de ces gens-là et une meilleure sécurité pour les usagers. Next. Donc, ce programme a été dupliqué dans l'essentiel des villes à travers le pays. On a quitté Dakar, on est maintenant sur 10 villes à travers le Sénégal. On a dupliqué exactement le même programme. Mais le programme a permis d'organiser le secteur et donner accès au financement à des acteurs qui n'étaient pas éligibles avec le système bancaire classique. Le suivi du cadre mis en place et la nouvelle organisation de l'exploitation ont permis d'assurer une rentabilité du service. Gage de remboursement. Et on a mis en place une structure financière qui a permis d'obtenir des taux d'intérêt stables. Voilà un secteur qui, auparavant, pour financer un véhicule, toutes les banques nous fuyaient. Aujourd'hui, chaque jour, on a des banques qui viennent visiter pour marquer leur intérêt pour financer le programme. On a pu accompagner, on a pu avoir des partenaires financiers et un partenaire industriel, Saint-Bus pour monter les bus et Mectrans pour donner des crédits, accompagner l'exploitation et Transbi pour accompagner les travailleurs dans les aspects sociaux. Et l'AFTU qu'on a mis en place, ce nouveau secteur aujourd'hui, assure 35% de part de marché par rapport à l'informel classique. Bien sûr, il y a beaucoup de choses à faire, il y a encore beaucoup de pas. Next. Donc, il y a encore plusieurs défis à relever. On a toujours une forte concentration à Dakar. Il y a encore beaucoup de congestion à Dakar qui demande à ce qu'on puisse mieux nous adapter. Il y a plusieurs projets, notamment le BRT et l'ETR, qui nous obligent aujourd'hui à réorganiser tout ça, à réglementer davantage la délivrance des licences et améliorer une meilleure organisation et une meilleure offre. Renforcer la capacité et le maillage du réseau routier. Et on prévoit que ces acteurs, à travers une nouvelle organisation qui sera mise en place pour ceux d'entre eux qui accepteront d'aller vers davantage de professionnalisation, nous prévoyons de leur confier la gestion des rabattements sur le TR et sur le BRT qui est en cours. Et nous sommes en contact avec les acteurs pour aller dans un deuxième niveau de professionnalisation qui consistera à les organiser, à les mutualiser davantage pour qu'ils puissent assurer le rabattement sur le TR et sur le BRT. C'est ce que je voulais partager. Je vous remercie.
Monsieur Ababakar, merci beaucoup pour votre présentation. En fait, les francophones peuvent maintenant rentrer à la translation. Merci beaucoup.
D'accord, merci.
Good. Thank you very much, Babakar, and for your great presentation. I'm sorry that we had some technical problems. I apologize to the audience for that. And now we can go to the Q&As. We have received a couple of questions. If you have any other questions, just feel free to ask them in the chat. Otherwise, I am going to ask again, Solène, to please come back to the fore and turn your camera on. Reginald, if you are still there, you can also turn your camera on. Ababakar as well. So I'm going to start with a question regarding first the paratransit toolkit. So a first question was by Andrea Sanhil. She's asking whether, apart from the decision makers in the co-creation process that were involved to develop this publication, whether other stakeholders have been consulted, such as operators or users? And if not, how can perhaps do you have any recommendations or ideas on how we could involve them perhaps in the future?
Yeah, of course. Regarding the elaboration of the document itself, so during the webinars, it was not necessarily decision makers. I had to rush for the sake of the timing, but it was actually a larger audience. So we also had practitioners and consultants as well involved with the topic. So it was actually a bit more diversified. However, it's true that operators were not represented, for the main reason being that the document is aimed to decision makers and practitioners, and we wanted to collect information and feedback from cities who tried to implement reform or implemented reform, and get the feedback on the process. Of course, if possible, I mean, this is also for the in the frame of this document, it was not possible to have a broader co-constructive process, but that's also what we wanted to emphasize in this document, that one of the main feedback from these discussions were the need to have a further discussion with the operators, and that's actually what we wanted to emphasize through the diagnosis, with the idea of doing this mapping of the sector and all the different stakeholders involved, and not just the operators, because there are also other, for instance, other jobs are connected to the sector, may it be regarding the maintenance, may it be the constructors, etc. And they are also that was also what we tried to emphasize within the actions, by having several actions which actually really target the dialogue to be implemented between the local government and the stakeholders. So this is, I mean, this was an attempt, and of course those 50 actions are not exhaustive. So maybe within the next future we will be able to enrich this catalog with more actions resulting from more feedback from a more diverse range of actors. Matteo, we cannot hear you.
Thank you for reminding me that my mic was off. Yeah, so we are running a bit late, so I'm going to ask you one more question about the publication, Solène. So Benji is asking whether the publication has anything to say regarding financing or funding for the informal transport sector.
So we mentioned, of course, the need to find appropriate funding, and especially also long-term source of fundings, meaning that most of the time there is a reform. There is, for instance, fundings for a fleet renewal scheme, but in order to support the reform, and this is also in this last section, like ensuring the support of the reform, we give leads, or actually we try to emphasize the need to have source of fundings for long-term actions. For instance, also training programs and capacity building programs, which are not just linked to one project, that are not just at one moment, but that also happening over the long term, and also to capacitate, of course, the stakeholders themselves. And through that, also one key point is also, of course, the pooling of resources between the actors themselves. But again, I mean, the point is just to give indications of what can be done, because this is also really broad actions. Then they have to be adapted to each context and each city, depending on the means, depending on the logic of actors, etc.
Maybe if I may jump in on this question, I think
Please,
what
Anne.
is well emphasized in the toolkit is that you need to tailor the reform in order to propose a win-win situation. So you cannot propose a situation where the operators have no incentive or are not making profit in the end. So you can either have a situation where you have subsidies, so then, okay, you can have improved quality, or you can tailor your service because you have subsidies, or, and it's very often the case, you can tailor reform when you have no subsidies. then you need to find other incentives and subsidies for the operator to improve what they are proposing in their offer. So you cannot just ask from them newer vehicles or scheduled services or I don't know, stops if you are not proposing anything in exchange to them. So I think that one of the important points of the toolkit is that you need to propose something to the operator in order to get something from the operator for the users.
Thank you, Anne and Solène. Now I see that Babacar is also already answering the questions in the chat. Thank you very much for that. That leaves me a bit more time to ask Reginald some questions. Reginald, Vincent was asking, so that you shared in your slide this distinction between transformation over transition. So Vance, I would like to know, so what was your decision to pick one or the other? So transformation over transition, and could you share a bit about that? Thank you. I'm sorry, I cannot hear you somehow. Not yet. Solène, can you hear? Listen? No. Okay, yeah, I can confirm that it's not only me. Not yet. I'm sorry, Reginald, we cannot hear you, but I mean, I can perhaps ask you just to use the chat function.
Now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Go ahead, please.
Oops, now I can't hear.
Go ahead. No problem. So should I ask you again the question, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what was the difference between this transformation and transition that you explained in the slide, and what was your decision to pick one or the other?
Okay. Can you hear me now? Can I speak?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, in our context, when the transition referred to when we rolled out BRT or our MyCity buses, we replaced all the minibus taxis or the informal minibus taxis. We replaced and we transitioned them over to formal bus operators. That's the distinction. And then the transformation refers to this transport operating company TOC model that we are piloting, where there's no BRT interventions, and our motive is purely just to transform the informal minibus taxi industry. So that's just the difference in our context between transition and transformation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Go ahead if you want to add
something.
And
now I saw the other quickly. I know you for time. So there was a question around the passenger numbers for the 7th Avenue. So their daily passenger volumes was around just under 9,000 passengers per day, about 8,700 passengers per day. And then what were the parameters that determine the viability of the TOC versus the association? So I've just jotted down a few parameters, and some of those are the length of the route. Obviously, a function or one of the parameters is the passenger numbers, and a key viability parameter is whether there's one or more taxi associations on the same route. And the reason why we chose 7th Avenue, because they were an association who was the only association on that taxi route. And then obviously another parameter is the business plan. When we work with the data, we need to see whether there's a potential for a reduced number of vehicles being able to transport the same amount of passengers. So those were some of the parameters that we have looked at to determine TOC viability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reginald, and thank you again very much to Ababakar, Reginald, and Solène for their presentations. Now we need to move on. I'm really sorry. So because we have still one presentation, and then we would like to jump into our interactive activity. Now the last presentation is about a cross analysis on the impacts of different tools from Cape Town, Dakar, and Kigali. And Anne will be sharing this presentation with us. Anne, are you still there? And the floor is yours. Let me know if I should share the presentation.
Yes, please, if you can share the presentation.
I am on it. 1 second, please.
So the idea was to have a bit of a summary of actually the various presentations we have to mix a bit what was presented by Solène as the tools presented in the toolbox, and with various cases of reform some interesting cases of reform. So for example, Dakar, Cape Town, and also we included Cape Town BRT, so my city, and Kigali. So that was a way to summarize what were the tools used in the main cases of reform, and what was the impact and the goals achieved with the use of these tools. Next, please. So to summarize a bit Dakar case, so for me, the main tools that were used in the reform, it was firstly to structure. So that I think is a very important step in all the reform of paratransit, with the setup of GIEs and then of the AFTU as well. The kind of contractualization that they had between the CETUD and the GIEs with a route concession. So it was the routes were allowed, it was a monopoly to the GIEs, which was given against adherence to certain standards. A very important tool also used in the Dakar case for me is the setup of the ticketing system. Yes, that's usually a very important lever in a paratransit reform. So there it was a paper ticketing, so it was a rather simple tool. It was nothing too complicated, but I think it was very transformative, because then you can start to monitor the fares revenue. I will jump then maybe to another very important tool that was used in the Dakar class. It was in the support tool described in the toolbox. It's a fleet renewal scheme, and access to finance. There was a support to access to finance to the operator. And maybe the last important tool used in the Dakar case, it was about funding, because there was really a care in the setup of a sustainable mechanism for funding, with a revolving fund on the setup of MECTRANS. What was achieved in Dakar thanks to the use of this tool? So increased transport service quality with a more structured network, identified stops where there was no identified stop, higher time amplitude, no more fill and go system, so higher predictability, newer vehicle, also increased transport services efficiency, especially with no more, or at least less competition within the market, because there is still some operators who are not adhering to the scheme and operating illegally. Improved jobs conditions, so that's a very, I think, important target which was achieved in Dakar case, with the introduction of social coverage for the workers, partial shift. So it was not completely done, but some drivers now are operating with contracts, on reduction of working hour, on reduction of negative externalities, less pollution, less congestion. That was for Dakar. Next, please. Yeah, so moving to Cape Town, I wanted to show both my city, so the BRT, and then the TOC, which was presented by Reggie just before, because my city, I think it's an example of typical reform that you can conduct in the case you have a BRT also. So it's not always the case that you have a BRT project, but when you are implementing a BRT project, then it's such a transformative project for a city that, of course, it has a huge impact on paratransit. So that was a very comprehensive reform, because it was together with the BRT, with, for example, the structure tool, with the setup of the vehicle operating companies, the VOC, bringing together former paratransit operator, contractualization again with a gross contract, so with VOC. So there are subsidies from the public sector. On the price and ticketing, the setup of a smart ticketing system. So again, this tool of the ticketing system to monitor the fare revenues, and maybe also to analyze the materials, because there in the BRT case, of course, there was a lot of effort on the construction of infrastructure for the BRT, on stations, on stop, even also for the feeder routes. So what was achieved with the use of these tools? Clearly improve transport service quality. So it's a complete different network after the implementation of the MyCity project. Increase transport service efficiencies, increase better job conditions, so contract schemes for drivers, better condition altogether, and reduce negative externalities. Moving to Cape Town TOC, next please. Next slide, please.
Can you see the slide, Anne?
Next slide, please. I cannot. Slide changing.
Okay.
So maybe just, so I cannot see the change, but maybe it has changed. So to say that Cape Town TOC, so it's, I wanted to share, to present the two examples of Cape Town, because TOC is quite a different example with less tool use and less resources and funds used from the public authority, with mainly the plan tool, how you define a new operation plan, the structure tool, so the need to set up transport operating companies, and the use of professionalized tools with quite important technical assistance. So less tools used and less resources from the public authority, but nevertheless important impacts with an expanded network in the end, fixed schedule. Improve also the transport services efficiency. So as Regis displayed, there is a more efficient service with reduced number of vehicles for improved services. Improve jobs conditions. So there again, an important impact on jobs condition with contract schemes for drivers, reduction of working hours, introduction of a day off, and again, reduction of negative externalities. Maybe a last example, next slide, please. In Kigali. So in Kigali, there was also somehow limited resources and funding from the public authority. So for example, the tool used, it was net cost contract per zone, so with a commercial risk on the operator. So there was a monopoly for 4 zones against adherence to standards. And maybe an important tool also here to highlight is the setup of a smart ticketing system. So even there, it was even a smart ticketing with a tap and go system. For which impact, quite important impact in Kigali with increased transport offer, now defined routes and stops, minimum amplitude, no more fill and go logic, increased transport service efficiency, no more competition within the market, control of the fare revenues. Should be connected.
And you're. I can hear you.
Can you? I am back.
Yes. No. You've been there all the time.
Sorry. It said it was not connected anymore. Sorry.
No problem.
They also improved jobs condition with a contract scheme for drivers, reduction of working hour, introduction of medical insurance, and reduce externalities. I put a question mark on Kigali successful reform because it's an example of reform which there was not a lot of funds and resources from the public authority and a lot achieved. And I think the issue with the Kigali or the question mark is that it was a huge burden on the operator where it's not very easy for them to make a profit in the end. So that was the whole for me on the cross cases analysis.
Thank you very much, and for this final presentation. So again, I'd like to say thank you to all of the speakers today. And the only thing that's missing today is this interactive activity that we would like to have with you. Mostly, we are going to have 4 breakout groups, and we want to discuss with you opportunities or how to use these actions and put them together for a specific case that we have prepared. So this activity will be in breakout groups. of 10 people, a bit bigger groups, and it will be only in English. I apologize for that. We cannot provide translation to French for this, but wait for us. We will get into the breakout groups. You will be there automatically, and we will share the instructions there. Thank you for staying with us this long, and see you in the breakout groups.
Thank you for participating. If you want, you can keep the link to the boards that we shared with you if you want to keep practicing and use this as an example to test the measures. And yeah, I mean, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to the speakers for these super insightful presentations. If you have questions, reach out to us, to Mobilize Your City through the website, download the publications, watch the recording. We are going to send it to you, and you have the presentations as well in the website. Thank you very much, and have a great evening and day, everyone. Thank you.